In January 2020, Britain finally left the European Union. However, while it was hailed by many as the chance to forge an independent place on the world stage, since then there's been little sign of the benefits promised by the Leave campaign. Instead, with mounting evidence that it's done severe economic damage, polls show that public opinion is turning against the decision and is increasingly open to rejoining the EU. But just how likely is this? And when could it even happen? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. We live in a world where we venerate the idea of democracy. Even the most undemocratic regimes will often proclaim their democratic principles and ideals. It's taken for granted that people should have the right to make the decisions that will affect their lives. But what happens when a nation takes a decision and then regrets it? In most true democracies, there's a chance to reverse it at the next election. A political party can pledge to fix the problem. But sometimes it may be more complex than this. One of the most interesting examples is the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. Having divided the population almost equally, any hopes that the issue would sink into the background and that people would accept the decision have since proven wildly optimistic. 7 years after the vote, the issue remains at the heart of British politics. More to the point, there are growing calls to reconsider the decision. Britain's relationship with Europe is underpinned by a long history. As a people, the British have been shaped by waves of immigration from the continent, whether it was the Celts, Romans, Saxons, Vikings, Danes, Normans or Huguenots. More to the point, over many centuries, Britain has also been intimately linked to the continent, politically, economically, militarily and socially. However, our story really starts on the 23rd of July 1952. As the continent emerged from the Second World War, the first steps were taken towards redefining the problematic relationship between France and Germany. Realising that economic interdependence would make war harder in future, they established what was called the European Coal and Steel Community. This was followed on the 25th of March 1957 with the Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community. Explicitly built on the idea of an ever closer union, it would eventually evolve to become the European Union as we know it today. From the start, Britain was ambivalent about this European integration. While it could see the advantages of cooperation and was a founder member of the Council of Europe, the continent's leading human rights body, it kept the EEC at arm's length, preferring instead to concentrate on rebuilding post-war ties to the empire. However, by the early 1960s, its position on the world stage had changed. With the Cold War in full swing and decolonisation now taking off, it had lost its preeminent place in international affairs. More to the point, it was falling behind Western Europe economically. In 1961, it took the monumental decision to apply to join the EEC. However, this was rejected by the French President Charles de Gaulle, who felt that Britain would undermine the community. Similarly, he vetoed another application several years later. But by the start of the 1970s, the French leadership had changed, and on the 1st of January 1973, the UK finally joined alongside Ireland and Denmark. From the outset, the relationship was complicated. Unlike the continental European members, Britain's heart was never invested in the political side of the project. Instead, it had joined for the economic benefits. And while Britain's membership was overwhelmingly endorsed in the 1975 referendum, by the 1980s, tensions were growing. Although Britain led the way in forming the single market, the landmark project to open trade across Europe, a dispute arose over funding, which saw the UK secure an unpopular rebate on its contributions. Meanwhile, the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher became steadily more opposed to calls for greater political integration. However, while things appeared to change in the late 1990s as a new Labour government took office under the pro-European Tony Blair, it ultimately did little to tackle the deep-rooted hostility towards Europe in much of the media or promote a more positive message across society. The government also stood back from major European projects, including the single currency, the euro, and Schengen, the project to create a border-free Europe. In 2010, the Conservatives returned to power as the senior partner in a coalition government. But while they sought to push the European debate to one side, large parts of the party nevertheless remained implacably opposed to Britain's EU membership. This all came to the fore in 2014, following a disastrous result in European parliamentary elections that saw the fiercely anti-European UK Independence Party, UKIP, win on the back of a campaign centred on European immigration. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, pledged to hold a referendum on membership if the Conservatives won the next election. All this would come back to haunt him when, in 2015, the Conservatives won a surprise victory. After negotiations to amend the terms of Britain's membership, including a formal commitment that Britain would never be bound by an ever closer union or required to join the euro, the country was launched into a highly divisive debate over EU membership. While the Remain campaign focused on the economic benefits of remaining in the European Union and argued that leaving would have disastrous consequences, the Leave campaign dismissed this, instead focusing on the questions of sovereignty and limiting immigration. Fighting a campaign marred in controversy, it argued that Brexit, as leaving the EU became known, would restore the country's independence and allow more money to be spent on public services. On the 23rd of June 2016, the UK went to the polls and voted to leave the European Union by a margin of 52 to 48%. Immediately, the country was then plunged into another debate about the form of Brexit to be followed. While many argued that Britain should remain a part of the single market, the requirement to allow European workers the right to continue to come to live and work in Britain was seen as politically unacceptable. Instead, the government pursued a so-called hard Brexit based on cutting ties to all parts and institutions of the European Union. Having triggered Article 50, the clause in the EU's treaties that allows a country to leave, the negotiations took several years to complete. As well as considerable acrimony between the sides, it also raised severe problems in Northern Ireland, where EU membership underpinned the 1998 Good Friday Agreement that had ended a long-standing conflict on the island. Despite this, by the end of 2019, a deal had been reached, and on the 31st of January 2020, the United Kingdom formally left the European Union. Since then, it's become clear that Brexit hasn't delivered on the Leave campaign promises. Most noticeably, Britain has seen a significant economic downturn. While many argued that the worst effects were caused by the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which provides independent economic forecasts for the government, has estimated that Brexit has led to a 4% drop in British gross domestic product. On top of this, the shortage of EU workers has helped to drive up inflation, thus leading to interest rate increases, with all the effects that this has had on the cost of living and mortgage payments. Meanwhile, new rules have made trade extremely difficult for many sectors, not least of all for agriculture and fishing, which had, by and large, favoured leaving. Although the government has pointed to new trade deals with other countries, these have offered minimal benefits and certainly don't do enough to offset the cost of Brexit to trade with the European Union, the UK's largest market. Added to all this, Brexit has had far wider adverse effects. For instance, it's now much harder for British citizens to live and work across the continent. Many countries now demand special skills or even independent financial means to be able to move there. All the while, few of the promised domestic benefits of Brexit have appeared, such as more spending on healthcare. All this has led to growing public discontent. Indeed, the latest polling shows that a clear majority now think that Brexit was a mistake. Naturally, all this has now led to questions about whether Brexit could be reversed. But is this really possible? First and foremost, it needs to be emphasised that Britain can't simply reverse Brexit. If it wants to be a member of the European Union, it'll have to rejoin. This requires going through a defined process of two parts. On the one hand, there's the procedural element of joining. The UK must ensure that it's again fully aligned with the EU's body of laws, the acquis communautaire. This is likely to be the easier bit. Having been a member for so many years and with relatively few divergences since leaving, this should be comparatively easy to manage. The second and far more difficult aspect will be the political decision by the members about whether to accept Britain back. While many senior European figures have said that the UK would be welcome to rejoin, EU leaders will want to be sure that it's committed to permanent membership if it does. No one wants the trauma of another exit process. This is likely to require several factors. For a start, there must be an unequivocal public commitment to membership. The British people must want it. This could be shown either through an overwhelming victory for a pro-membership party in a general election, or, more likely, in a referendum won by a significant margin in favour of membership. But EU leaders will also want to see a commitment in other ways. In the past, Britain had opt-outs on fundamental elements of EU membership, including the euro and Schengen. This time, the UK will need to sign up to both if it wants to rejoin. While it won't have to join either of them immediately, accepting them in principle will be a requirement. This will be a tough pill for many in Britain, even amongst rejoiners, where commitment to the pound is strong and where the question of borders is highly political. But even if public opinion does firmly swing behind rejoining, this all begs the question of when it could happen. In truth, it won't be any time soon. For a start, neither of the main political parties, Labour or the Conservatives, will put rejoining on their manifestos for the next general election, which is due to be held by January 2025. Indeed, the opposition Labour Party, which is currently on course to win the election, has even stated that its official policy is to try to make Brexit work. Assuming a full 5-year parliamentary term follows, this means that the earliest that rejoining will feasibly be on the political agenda will therefore be 2030. As for the talks, even assuming that the level of divergence remains minimal, it's likely to take at least 2 to 3 years to complete the process. It'll then need to be ratified by the member states. This could take up to a further 2 years. Even under the most optimistic scenario, therefore, this means 2035 at the earliest. Of course, many steps can be taken before then, including joining many EU programmes and initiatives. The most important of these will be the single market. But while this would help to rebuild trade and boost the economy, it'll also come with a renewed commitment to accept freedom of movement. This may still be far too politically sensitive for either of the parties. But even though all this would make rejoining far more straightforward, the simple reality is that Britain is nevertheless unlikely to be ready, able or willing to rejoin the European Union for a long time yet. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.